Hello to everybody, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee hiding behind my microphone, and so does coffee. Um, so today, uh, we are I see all these thumbs up coming along the side of the screen. It's very hard not to notice that. Today we're talking about something that in a way we've talked about before, but not quite in this way. And as I said a moment before we officially began, I'm going to have a question at the end, and I don't know the answer to it. I tried to come up with it, and then I decided it would be much more fun for us to figure this out together. I'm not going to say more than that. But in one way or another, what sparked this thought today and our conversation today was the statement that the times that we are living through are going to end up in history books. And that is just true. Now, any time can be historic. So it's not as though history stops happening and then suddenly starts happening, but these are wacky times. So, and there's a lot happening, and a lot of it, I won't say unprecedented, but, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. A lot of it happening at the same time in the way it's happening, pretty distinctive. So anyway, before I plunge into that, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. Really excited for today's topic. The way this works is if you're with us here on Zoom, keep chatting. The chat is on fire this morning. Same thing if you're joining us from Facebook. But as Joanne's talking this morning, I'm sure you're going to have some questions. Those need to go down below in the Q&A. In about 30 minutes, I'm going to pop back in and I'll look for your questions there. So don't forget to put them in the Q&A. See you guys in a little bit.
Okay. So didn't actually really adjust my screen. Okay, that's better. So ending up in the history books and what that's going to look like. Oh, and I should say before I begin, anyone who is here, we've had a lot of people coming in recent weeks for the first time. If you are here for the first time or near the first time, please say so in chat, because the community that has built up here, what are we, 226th episode? I'm making that up, but it's pretty close. That we've done 225 previous episodes, and there's a real community here. So if you say that you're here for the first time, you will get a robust welcome from the community. So do so in chat. Okay. And I will welcome you. Welcome. So our times ending up in the history books. As I suggested a moment ago, right? And I'm going to say this word a lot of times in this episode. It's a word I always use. It's a word that I use often enough that you guys, the community, like, not only do I say it all the time, you guys know I'm going to say it all the time. And now when I do anything else and mention this word, I think of you. Contingency. Contingency is going to have a lot to do with this conversation. Obviously, times are always contingent in a way. We live in time looking forward. We can't tell what's coming down the pike. We can guess, we can predict, but we don't know. And that's true, historically speaking, for everybody living through a time, right? So as a historian, when I'm studying people, I have to really remind myself to put myself in that moment as far as what people can see and know. So, for example, with my last book, I had to act as though I didn't know that there was a civil war coming, not very far away, right? That was tricky. But the people I was writing about, they might have suspected it. They might have been scared of it. I don't, like I wrote about what they were thinking. They didn't know. So times are always contingent. Everyone is always looking forward in time. However, as I've said any number of times before, we really live in times of extreme contingency. And by that, I mean, in some big ways, bigger than is typical, we don't know what's going to happen in ways that provoke anxiety among some, in big fundamental structural ways. Things could go in a lot of directions, and we live with that in a way that's the tempo of our time. And so I want to unpack that a little bit and incorporate that with this idea about what does it mean to live in that kind of time and put it in historical perspective. Now, I'll start out by saying the number of times, and I don't know how many years, a chunk of years, let's say the last 8 years, random number, recent years, the number of times I'm asked, has this ever happened before? Now, that's always a question historians get asked, but the frequency and the urgency with which that is asked in recent years, people really want to know, have we been here before? Have we been here before? Has it ever happened before? And, sometimes, and we've seen it here in our conversations on History Matters, sometimes an absolute yes or an absolute no isn't possible. Sometimes you can talk about, well, in this way, this happened at this point. Maybe this happened partly in that point. That might not even be particularly helpful. But considering the question in historical context actually can be helpful, if not absolutely determinative of what's happening right now. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Has this ever happened before? Let's talk about briefly the state, and this is close to my political historian heart, the state of both the Republican and Democratic parties. Now, we've been watching whatever's going on with both parties. It's been up close and personal for us, particularly for us here on History Matters. If you take a step back, maybe even up close and personal, you can see that both of these parties are kind of morphing into something, and we don't know quite what that something is going to be. I said in a recent conversation I had actually with Heather Cox Richardson, I said something like that. This is a moment of remarkable fluidity in the parties. We honestly, and I'm not exaggerating, right? We have MAGA mostly on one side, and we could talk about whether they're a party or not. That's a different conversation, maybe, and a different question, but whatever they are, they're pretty distinctive, the MAGA people. Well, I won't even go on in that direction. I'll just say, are they a party? Where are they going? And what is happening to Republicans who are not comfortable with MAGA? Well, recently we're seeing some people march over to the left, in which another interesting thing is happening, right? There's something happening to the Democratic Party, really interesting. I don't think it's just a wave of energy. I think it's some kind of fundamental shift in the dynamics or in the outlook or in the presentation. We don't know yet, but in one way or another, on both sides, there's something fundamentally structural, transformative that has been happening on the right and that is happening on the left in a way that when I look back in American history, there have been lots of times when, parties have changed, they've morphed, they've, divided, they've whatever. And I've mentioned before, if you go to, there's a website that I always search on, Bio Guide, but it's a biographical directory of members of Congress. And one of the things that you can do there is just ask for a list of the parties that people have belonged to in Congress. And the number of parties, folks, it's not just Democrat or Republican, Independent, Jacksonian, Jeffersonian. There are a lot of parties. And particularly in the 19th century, they came and went a lot. So we are used to assuming that basically there are two parties and, the Green Party, that's nice. And then they went away. It has not always been even as seemingly cut and dried as it is now. That said, this kind of moment when there's something fundamental and structural happening on both sides, and it's kind of hard to predict what it is. And I think it goes beyond individual candidates on both sides. I don't think this is just about Trump. I think it's bigger. And I don't think this is just about Kamala, although I think she's leading it. Whatever's happening, we don't know the outcome. And as Heather and I said, well, we don't know what's going to happen. This is kind of uncharted territory for us. So let's see. So that's one way in which there's something fundamental, structural in the parties, and also in what the parties are doing and presenting that's pretty major at this point. I'll come back to this in a moment. We could talk about how fundamentally democracy and the way each party does or doesn't support it is up for debate. But right now, we'll focus on parties. Unclear what's happening. Has this happened in this way with this much change at a time of such high stakes? Not quite in this way. Another thing that we could say, again, not unprecedented, but in this circumstance, distinctive, put it that way. The press being as unbalanced as it is. Now, I will be the first person to say the press has been unbalanced in some way or another forever, right? And in a way, the worst offender is in my original time period, right? The 1790s, the early 19th century. Those were party newspapers. They claimed to be about objective fact, and they sometimes would reprint articles about both sides of an argument, but the press was, highly biased. And as a matter of fact, objectivity in the press is a much, much later development. So I'm not saying like, gasp, the press is suddenly unbalanced. But what I am saying is what is distinctive about this moment in that regard, it's really, really visible to the public in part because of social media, in part because people can say, what the heck? Like, what is this headline? Or why on 52 million zillion channels did I see this and never see this? Or why this thing that I found a way to see is no one talking about it? And not only is that interesting in and of itself, but then you can say that on social media, and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people will see that and think about it and respond to it. So it's not the simple fact that the press is unbalanced. It's partly the fact that it's so obviously visible because of social media and so quickly encompassed, embraced, maybe even exaggerated. It makes it more of a factor, or different, let me put it this way, I'm more comfortable with this, a different kind of factor than an unbalanced press has been in the past. Now, and I will say to folks, I was happily tooling around here doing something last night, I don't know, and I saw someone say, if you're not watching Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, turn it on now. And that was pretty direct. I don't normally see that sort of thing. And so I turned on Lawrence O'Donnell, and I will say, if you haven't seen that, and I know some people are angry at MSNBC, Lawrence O'Donnell is doing his own thing. And yesterday, the first chunk of that show, he, with like a real righteous fury, talked about how the press, and it was sparked by Trump's press conference, in which he wandered all over the place and made things up and did what he did, but did it in an even more extreme way than he normally does. And the press sat there and politely asked questions and didn't challenge him in any way. So O'Donnell talked about how inappropriate this is, what a failure in responsibility this is. He showed, as a point of comparison, people trying to get someone to talk about whether President Biden, how often had he seen a neurologist? What did it mean? And they were like questioning, and an answer came, and they were questioning, and it was like push, shove, push, shove. And the Trump press conference, everyone was just sitting there sort of taking what he said. And he was, not only offering a lot of whoppers, but he was, that's why I said press conference. I don't know quite how to describe it, but he was all over the place and no one was calling him on it. And as O'Donnell said, a lie is not an answer to a question. So I do say, and I'm not saying this to rant about Trump particularly, but I am saying what O'Donnell did was not about Trump. It was about the press and the fact that on one side, they're not following through, asking questions, demanding answers. He said it with such power and such force. He got so mad at one point that he threw his papers on the ground. At any rate, I highly recommend it. It'll make you think. You may agree or disagree, but that's what he's talking about, is this, which is why I don't know if I've ever seen like a, MSNBC anchor get so mad that they like literally threw something. It kind of made me, whoa, what just happened there? So find it and watch it and see what it makes you think. But whatever's happening right now in the press, pretty darn distinctive. And at this kind of moment, when we're talking about democracy and how and if it's going to survive this moment, that's its own special thing. I'm not going to go into detail on this one because it's obvious. But another way in which this time will go into the history book is that one of the major two parties candidates is a convicted felon who lies constantly and appears to be in cognitive decline and just has support. that whole phenomenon, not typical, right? So that all by itself is going to have a lot of historians trying to figure out what this moment means. I'll throw in as far as things that are happening now that will make it into the history books. An active, visible, organized, ongoing attack on our structural electoral process, trying to rig it in some way. And I hate using that word because I know that the right says it's rigged. But if you're trying to enable people to intervene with the counting of votes and decide what you like or don't like about them before allowing that counting to proceed, that's a problem, right? And we're seeing some Republican legislatures in some states coming up with ideas like this to really just, not just throw a wrench in the process, but just take it. That kind of sustained effort to really concretely, physically, mechanically mess with the electoral process that is the hub, the heart of a democracy, of a democratic government, of how we function, the idea that there are free and fair elections, and that we, as citizens of the United States, have the right and duty to go to those elections, state what we want, and have the outcome be a reflection of what everyone has done with their votes. That's a pretty fundamental, basic fact. And if you're really structurally trying to mess with that simple fact, not only are you not just interfering with democracy, wounding and potentially toppling democracy, but you're eroding people's faith in the electoral process, which is also a problem. So again, have people tried to mess with the electoral process before? Yes. In this way, in this kind of structured way, sustained, multiple states supported seemingly by a major party, we live in special times. I won't even go to detail on this one because it's obvious. Giving a president immunity, I mean, I've ranted about that already, folks. All episodes of History Matters are archived at the same. If you've beamed in through the National Council for History Education website, you'll see them all there, and they're on YouTube as well with the National Council of History Education, and I'm slowly putting them up. I created a YouTube channel. So anyway, they're there. You can go, you can look, you can find it. But presidential immunity, essentially giving a president the power, in a way, of a king who can do no wrong, where that's beyond unprecedented. And granted, if you look at the presidency and you look at it over the long haul, it's been constantly on an upswing of power, right? In the 19th century, certainly in the mid and even a little bit past the mid 19th century, Congress was at the center of press coverage of things. Congress is what took up the majority of column inches in newspapers. People read congressional debates or synopses of them. People knew what was happening on the floor in a way that we don't. And the presidency was being reported on, and some presidents got a lot of attention, Andrew Jackson. But generally speaking, it was Congress that was at the center of things, certainly in the American mindset. Over time, we've seen, and this is certainly not a new idea, the power of the presidency and the centrality of the presidency to American government rise. So that pattern is consistent, but giving a president immunity, off the charts, just off the charts. I'm going to stop myself there because I'll really start ranting if I start talking about that. So in a way, what we're talking about is structural, is sweeping. If you take everything that I just said together, it's questioning some pretty fundamental democratic standards, assumptions, structures. There's a real questioning and testing of some pretty fundamental things in our political system. And back to extreme contingency, we truly don't know where we're going or what the outcome will be. And perhaps it will be really bad, and perhaps it will be really good, and we don't know. So, and really bad and really good have pretty extreme definitions right now. So we're at a moment where the our belief in democracy and the structure of our government and the faith that we have in each other as a nation and the faith that we have in the functioning of the government is being fundamentally challenged. And the outcome is unclear. Now, this leads back to the question I started with. What is this going to look like in the history books, right? It's going to end up in the history books. What will it look like? So we could start by saying a few things, right? I'm trying to imagine history books of the future. Maybe they will discuss this era as a moment of a major course change, right? That like the civil rights era, when suddenly there was a major course change, or as I've talked about many times before, the election of 1800, when the Federalists get booted and suddenly there's a more small d democratic government put in place, and that represented to Americans a real shift in power, in mentality, in vision for the nation. Maybe that'll be part of what books say. Ooh, that was a moment when there was a major course change. I'm not going to say pivot. And it's not quite a pivot. That's not exactly right here. Okay, maybe textbooks will say, this is a moment, this is a period when democracy itself was put to the test. Will it survive or will it not? Not in an intellectual way, not in an ideological way, but in a structural, functioning way. That might be one way in which books try to lump together this time period. Maybe this will be depicted as an era in which white men who were used to having unquestioned power began seeing that changing demographics and the changes in politics meant they did not have unquestioned power and began being willing to do anything to cling to power. So maybe this will be seen as an era in which, because of the direction the nation was going, white men began to take aggressive, and I'm not going to say unprecedented, but extreme actions to the point of fundamental structural change, to the point of deconstructing democracy to maintain power. Maybe books will talk about this as an era in which Black women led the way. That is striking. And actually, no matter how this period is labeled or branded, that's a huge part of this time period. Of course, it's a huge part of many time periods, and it doesn't normally get recognized, but it's kind of in our face here. And particularly now, you can't avoid it with Kamala Harris, but apart from her, in every realm, Supreme Court and Congress, local governments, the judicial process, local judicial process, in every way, Black women are stepping up and standing hard, and that matters. Okay, so far, right, I'm going to go back here. Maybe it's a period of a major course change. Maybe it's a period when we're really testing whether democracy will live or die. Maybe it's this era in which white men who feel entitled to power actually are coming forward and having like the extreme showdown of can they really keep it or not. Maybe it's going to be talked about as an era in which Black women led the way. Maybe it's just going to be seen as an era of extremes, right? And I will add, reinvigorated racism. That's sadly not new, but that's part of what's going on now. But, if you think about what this period might look like or what might be grouped together, and we can talk about this during the Q&A, but if you just think about Obama's election, the sort of backlash against that, the rise of Trump, the pandemic during the Trump presidency, January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, Biden becoming president as kind of a response to January 6th, and then Harris plunging in and getting this wave of enthusiasm. Obama, Trump, COVID, January 6th, Biden, Harris. That's a period of time. And one might be able to say that in one way or another represents people testing the system and testing responses, right? Having a Black president sent some people over the rails. Didn't cause everything that's happening, but it sure did help. So again, maybe in one way or another, that's the boundaries of this period. I'm spitballing here, folks, because the fact of the matter is we don't know, and we can't tell now, right? We don't know what's coming next. Maybe something will come next that will reshape how we're understanding this, but these are all possibilities. So here's the part Oh, and I'm just in time. I'm so timing this so well. Here's the part I'm going to raise it now, and we can talk about it during the Q&A. So if indeed what I've just described, and I just added together a chunk of time in a string, Obama, Trump, COVID, January 6th, Biden, Harris, bonk, chunk of time. What would that era be called? Now, we don't, time doesn't progress in chunks of eras. We know this. That said, there are chunks of time that have a theme, and then they get branded. The Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, right? There are chunks of time, I guess the Depression, but that's really an event, but still, there are periods that get branded like that because that really epitomizes what's happening in that era. So my question is, what do we call this era? Given only the data we have now and only what's happening now, what do we call this era if we're trying to be thematic, like Gilded Age, Progressive Era? I started thinking about this and then I had to stop. I was going to come up with a brilliant answer and ran out of time because I had to get ready to be here on time. Here are the things I began with, but I think you guys, given how this community is always on fire, probably can come up with a better idea. First, I said the anxious age, or the age of anxiety, but that doesn't work. There's lots of anxious ages. Then I said the time of democratic trials of democracy, whatever. That didn't work either. I started playing with the idea of a new left and a new right, but there have been lots of, that doesn't really make this period stand out. And then I stopped because I thought, this is a community question. We can talk about this, about how you would characterize it and what you would put in a textbook as a way to epitomize what's happening now. One way or another, my point here is not only do we not know what's going to happen, but we know it's a moment in which there could be major change. And we need to be aware of that and keep our eyes open. We need to not take anything for granted. We need to watch what's happening and think about outcomes and act on what we see happening, right? This is yesterday, Lawrence O'Donnell said, now is a time to push back on the press, right? Now is the time to speak up and speak out about what's happening. Now, some of us have been doing that all along, but still, now is a time to see what's happening and talk about it, expose it, push against it. And the same holds true with many of the things I've just described. It's so easy to see individual things like, ooh, Trump's an unusual candidate. Yay, we had a Black president. Look, Kamala's an amazing candidate, and see things individually like that and not think about the fact that there's something bigger going on that we need to be thinking about and aware of, and that we need to be evaluating our responsibilities as citizens to speak up and speak out, be aware, and demand action in some way. Peaceful protest? I don't know. We can talk about it. But the fact of the matter is, we need to think about our responsibilities as citizens. I was writing something yesterday. I'm going to end soon. I don't want to go too much over our time. I'm actually writing something, which has not been happening a lot recently, but I am. And I started it with a quote or quotes from John Adams that I have talked about here before, when in his old age, people kept coming forward to him in letters and saying, tell us about what it was like. Tell us about the writing of the Declaration. Tell us about voting for independence. Tell us the story. And what he kept doing over and over again was saying, we didn't know what we were doing. Like, I think I've mentioned this before. He said, I remember sitting in the Second Continental Congress and watching people sign the Declaration, and there were a lot of people who were not happy to be signing that document. It wasn't a big wave of patriotism that swept everyone forward. We weren't sure what we were doing. We made mistakes all the time. People didn't like what was happening necessarily. We were not perfect. We were figuring it out as we went along. And guess what? The reason why that's important for people to know is because we're in a similar situation, having to do the same thing. We're figuring things out as we go. And in a sense, what Adams was saying is, whatever we were doing, the responsibilities and impact of what we were doing, that's the work. That's what you do. We weren't special. And guess what? the work's going to have to continue. You're going to have to keep working and figuring things out. And sometimes you may make mistakes, but you have to be willing to step up and do that. And don't assume that somehow we did something perfect and you can step back, because that didn't happen. That's a powerful message. Anyway, I will stop there. We're 3 minutes over. And I'm sure, although I've covered up comments, I was going to say, as soon as I uncover comments, I see mug. Okay, so, oops, I almost spilled it. For those of you who are new here, every week for 226?
228. Carolee said 228. I know.
228.
She says
228.
228. I trust Carolee. She's
no, I totally trust Carolee.
way better at numbers than I am.
She is the timekeeper. I never get it right. 228. So 227 episodes, I have a mug that in one way or another reflects on the theme of what we're talking about. I've used this one before, but not in the same sense. Okay, so it's history should make you uncomfortable. I use it now. In the past, I've used it for, bad things are happening and we should feel uncomfortable. What I mean now is we don't know what's happening and we need to be aware and live in this moment and take advantage of this moment. Tom gave the mug. So that's the other thing, is that I can't remember the episode. I can't remember who gave me the mugs. I know that on Slack, there's like someone keeps track.
Somebody had a spreadsheet, but I don't know if they've kept it up, and I can't remember who started it.
But Tom, I see it's Tom. Thank you, Tom. So I mean this kind of in a good sense today, right? Uncomfortable meaning, yeah, we don't know what's happening, but that could be opportunity, right? That could be, we can move ahead. We can do good things. So I don't mean a doom mug. I just mean this kind of represents the moment that we're in.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if there's a Lawrence O'Donnell mug. We should.
Well, I tell you what he said yesterday. I woke up and I looked at, glanced at social media, and it's all over the place. And you can easily find it because everyone's reposting it. I mean, honestly, it was off the charts.
I was watching the Olympics, so I missed it. So I'm going to go back and watch it now.
I only watched it because I see all the way back. I'm trying to catch up on chat. I see 28 from Carolee. Okay. Now I've caught up. That I wasn't watching either. And it was because of course I'm like watching something online on TV, and I don't really care about it. And I'm probably throwing things away, and looked at social media, and what I saw was, turn it on now. If you're not watching, watch it now. And I thought, well, that's kind of unusual. Yeah. So I missed the first 5 minutes, but okay, I'll stop.
Wow.
Oh, and someone says, how do we gift mugs to Dr. Freeman? You send them to NCHE. And I don't know that address. Maybe Claire, if you can post in chat where people can send mugs. Although I will say, if you do that, which is very nice, you don't have to feel compelled to do that. A month from now, you're probably going to want to wait a little bit, because at some point in September, I won't be here anymore.
We're gonna do a mug shower. I told you, when you get settled, we're gonna do a mug shower, like a what do they call it when you buy a new house? Oh God, I had it the other day.
Housewarming.
Housewarming. Thank you. I said it like a couple weeks ago. We need to do a mug warming party.
Mug warming or house mugging.
Oh, don't mug our house, please.
Don't mug my house.
We don't want anybody to get locked up.
At any rate, if Claire could put the address there, I don't know.
Gosh, we already have 16 questions.
Oh, that's good.
That might be a record. Okay. So our good friend Sydney asks, what are some differences between having presidents and vice presidents who are upper class, like lawyers, wealthy families, versus working class, such as teachers? Watch it, Sydney. Considering that Tim Waltz is a former teacher, will that work in his favor or work against him? I don't know if anybody's ever done an analysis of that. No,
it's really interesting. And it is true. Generally speaking, we have elite folk running for president, vice president. Actually, generally speaking, people in Congress also sort of fit into that realm. At some point in my most recent book, I actually went in and looked at charts and lists of like how educated people were in Congress, et cetera, et cetera. It does tend to be elite, but there were a lot more, common man people in Congress in the past than there are now. But the question of what Walz's candidacy is going to do. Once again, we don't know. What's interesting is that Vance has been pitching himself as Mr. Rural America, right? Sort of Mr. Non-elite guy. And now we have someone who appears to actually represent that in some way. Not rural America necessarily, but more rural America, but definitely Mr. not as elite as the typical politician guy, who also was a teacher. I mean,
And a
I'm
really
sorry.
good one, apparently.
Apparently, seemingly, his students are stepping up. At any rate, how will that affect the race? I don't know. But I do think it'll be a factor because people are responding to it, right? And they're people who don't like him are coming at him about sort of creating military career crises. And again, we don't know what'll happen with that, but it could have an impact. As someone who, Daniel, I think it's contingent. It is.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Good question.
How can a Yale Law School grad be non-elite? No, it's a good question. I mean, what I was going to say a moment ago, and I got off the path, is what we call middle class, upper class, and lower class. In a way, those don't quite have meaning anymore, because whatever we call middle class, there's so much merging and there's so much people claiming to be one or the other, and there's the people who are upper class, like how upper is upper class, but there's at any rate, that's a different question. But in social studies teacher, thank you, Gloria, that initially in early America there weren't classes in the way that we understand them now. People talked about men of the first quality, leading men, secondary men, always men. But they didn't have cut and dried terms like that. That came over time, that the terms came along, and then the idea that there were classes. There's gentlemen and non-gentlemen, but still. So, that's, yeah, you can be elite without being elitist, I suppose. But this is a different question. Am I elite? I don't know. I mean, you could say I am because I have a highfalutin education and I live in a nice apartment in New York City. I'm not super rich, but I don't know if that's what you have to be elite. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't feel elite, but you could point to me and say, you're a freaking Yale professor who lives in New York City. Shut up. So I'm not going to say I don't see myself that way, but you could brand me that way, and I suppose there'd be an argument for it. But it's a really good question, and I'm watching to see how it's going to shape. There's going to be a vice presidential debate, I believe. That might help answer that question. I know that might shed light on that question. Okay.
All right. Oh my gosh, we still have so many questions. Okay. Dave says historians say we need 2 functioning parties for politics to work. Could or should the US have 3 or 4 viable parties? And if so, what would that look like?
I mean, it's true. We definitely need 2. So part of that statement isn't necessarily saying we don't need more, but it's one doesn't work. One is bad. We definitely need at least 2. There could be more. There have been more. But normally that third party doesn't stick around for a really long time. It gets, absorbed, or a major issue comes along and sort of divides people into camps. So, I don't know for sure what it would look like. It's not impossible, but we tend to, in a way, in part because of democracy and the fact that, an issue comes along and we have opinions and they tend to divide us. I know that can happen everywhere, but our particular system kind of rewards you when you do that electorally, politically. I don't know what that would look like, but it's possible. And if we end up with, MAGA and Democrat and Republican, we could, I don't know, or something else. I have no idea.
All right. Ben is with us. Hi, Ben. Ben Hughes asks, in your opinion, how much time must pass before true history is written about a period or an important person versus aggregated journalism? Ooh, I love this question. Wow. I would love to read the history of this period written 100 years from now, but I don't think I'm going to live forever.
It's unfortunately true for all of us.
Yeah.
No, so you're great question, because certainly
Great question.
You're going to need the perspective of time to really get your arms around what the heck this era is in a way that we cannot do now. So you're right. I'm going to want to see a history book, I don't know how long in the future, 50 years down the road. I don't know how long, because there's so many I don't knows. But you're right. To get the best perspective on what's happening now, we need the perspective of time. The other part of that question, I think it was journalism versus historians. Is that true?
Yeah.
What was the first part? So, and that's a really good question too, right? Because journalists are going to be talking about history, but seeing it through a news filter. Historians, generally speaking, and this is not true of all historians, are certainly going to be thinking about news and events and what's happening, but they're going to be looking at society and culture, and historians are trained to look at huge swaths of evidence, seeking patterns, and then kind of coming up with what that means. Journalists could do that too, but that's going to be more typical, I think, of what a historian does. I don't know if the accounts by journalists and historians will necessarily be very different, but I do know that the historian accounts will bombard you with details of evidence to prove what they're saying, because that's what we are trained to do. A million bazillion footnotes to show you could track our work one way or another. Here, Troy says journalists write the first draft of history. I'm not going to, as much as I said about being angry at some of the press right now, I'm not going to downplay the press, because they're wonderful journalists who have written wonderful history. But yeah, I would think in some fundamental ways that there will be differences that have to do with the lens you're looking through.
Yeah. At AHA, Rachel Maddow was on one of the panels. I remember some people were criticizing the organization, saying, she has a book out that has to do with history. And a lot of people were being very picky about, well, she's not a historian. So that was an interesting debate within a debate. Kind of a side debate.
It is, right? Who is a historian? Who isn't a historian? What does it mean to be a historian? Do you have to have actual training to be a historian? Those are really charged questions that I am not going to answer right now. All I can tell you is I'm trained. Right, I'm trained as a historian. That's all I'm going to say. I don't think you have to have a PhD to be a historian. I think having a PhD allows you to do certain things in a particularly skilled way. It's a big question, but that's interesting. I didn't know that debate happened about.
Rachel. Oh yeah,
that's very interesting.
Okay, guys, I'm just going to make a comment. Some of your questions are multiple paragraphs. I need you to work with me here. They're too long. I'm gonna try and knock out some of the shorter ones, and if we have time, we'll get to the multiple paragraphs.
I'm gonna say something really, really quickly. Okay. Sydney says it's good pattern recognition, helpful in being a historian. Yeah. You look at the past, you absorb stuff, and then you try and figure out what the pattern is, and then you try and understand what the pattern means. Is a big part of historical analysis. Okay. Lots of questions. I'll stop.
Okay. Our friend Lori, who's with us quite often, hi Lori, says, in my lifetime, there have only been two significant parties. In the past, what caused the shift in the two-party system to be so dominant? Did one party die before the next one rose to prominence, or did a third crowd out one of the two main ones?
Well, all kinds of things happened. But, one example of this would be in the middle of the 19th century, when the slavery issue was the issue. How did people feel about it? What were they going to do? You had two parties, and then you had one party which divided when it came to slavery, and there was the Republican Party was formed out of that. The Whig Party ultimately went away. So in part, that's an example of what I mentioned a moment ago, which is that an issue comes that really divides people, and you were for or against the status, the way in which slavery was going to play a role in this country. You either were going to support it and allow it to continue, or you were going to draw a line and say, no, we're done. And that was that moment. So that was what divided it. And that was part of why, when you look at the rise of the 19th century Republican Party, which is not the 20th century or 21st century Republican Party, but the 19th century Republican Party came to power in a wave because it said, we are the anti-slavery party. And some people were anti-slavery because they wanted free soil and they didn't want slavery to spread across the West. Some actually paid attention to the immorality of slavery. There were a number of different reasons why people might have been anti-slavery, but they were anti-slavery. So a northern anti-slavery party that came to power and absorbed the part of the Whig party that, what do we do about slavery? I don't know. They came to power because that resonated, right? Bam. Okay. A lot of us are looking for that. We're with you. That's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. We just don't know now, because that kind of stuff can happen. Doesn't necessarily happen all the time. But when there's an issue that resonates and it feels important and fundamental to people, and then someone steps forward and says, I'm here to represent one stand on this issue, and a lot of people have to agree, you can have political transformation.
All right. Our good friend Gloria put 2 questions in, but they're short, which we love. So I'm going to combine them. That's how much we love it, Gloria. Okay. So part 1 is, she says that Vice President Harris doesn't seem to be meeting with the press at all. What does that say about the press? And she also wondered if you think the way that Harris was chosen was a democratic process.
Okay, so the first half, which is
not
she's not talking to the press. I woke up thinking about that this morning, actually, because everyone was saying it yesterday because of the Trump press conference, and they're like, she doesn't. How many weeks has she been running now?
2 and a half.
Okay, that's part of my answer to the question. I woke up and I was like, wait, it's only been like 15 days. So yeah, she hasn't had a press conference yet. That is true. And she needs to, and she should. However, evaluate what you're judging and when you're judging it and how much time she's had to do what she does. She did stop yesterday and take questions, I think before boarding a plane or something. I watched some of it, but you're right. She hasn't had like a formal press conference, a formal moment to be interviewed or to be asked questions, and she needs to, but I'm not angry that hasn't happened in 14 days, but it needs to, right? It's in part a talking point, right? She's not willing to. We'll see. Actually, we'll see. She needs to. We'll see. And was there a second? Oh, do I think it was Democratic? Well, okay. So I think that Biden and Harris were both chosen in a primary, and then Biden stepped down, but it's not as though Harris appeared out of nowhere, right? She was already on the ticket. Do I think that's undemocratic? I don't. But I could see how people would point to that and argue that. I think our system is set up so that, you have a ticket. And when half of the ticket goes away, it kind of makes sense you turn to the other person on the ticket. She hasn't been. Oh, well, right, because the convention has to happen. I think that's next week, right? That the convention, that she'll get the official nomination. I think, I guess, as I started out by saying, nothing about this particular moment is typical. I don't think it's undemocratic. And the fact of the matter is, if people really objected to her, they could go to the convention and object and make it so that she didn't get the nomination. They could. So she was officially named. Anyway, I'm trying to keep up with the chat at the same time that I'm answering the question. So do I think it's democratic? I do. Do I think in part that's because it could be changed if people wanted to change it? I don't think that's going to happen, but it could. That's part of an answer.
All right.
Yeah, actually, Julia says, is Trump really giving press conferences? Right. So he called people to Mar-a-Lago and stood there, and people politely sat. This is what Lawrence was ranting at. Politely sat in their seat and asked questions which he didn't answer or lied about. I don't know if any of you saw that he claimed him and the crowds, man. He claimed that the crowd for his rally was bigger than the crowd for Martin Luther King. Can you imagine? Anyway, I won't go there. Yes. And I see, is it Jim or James?
I think it's James Dennis, and he takes the vowels out for some reason.
Oh, I know, but does he like to be called Jim or?
I thought it was James, but I guess James. He can let us know.
I'll start with James. Donald Cole is great on the rise of the historian, of the Jacksonians, and in particular, he wrote a lot. I know his name because he wrote a lot about New Hampshire politics, which is where my little guy was from. But no, he's he's good on these topics. James
Right.
Dennis, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, it's James. Okay, another one of our good friends, Troy, who got to play guitar with Springsteen, but I'll forgive him. Troy asks a couple of things. I'm going to combine them because he did nice short ones. He says, will it always be that the right is seen as conservative and the left is progressive? Will that always be, and that the right is seen more comparatively anachronistic, whereas the left will be seen as progressive and always futuristic? Has that just always been the way it is? Or do you think that's, moving forward, it'll continue to be?
Well, I mean, so the general idea, if you step away from party names, is that left is more liberal and right is more conservative. That's the general idea. There are all kinds of ways in which those labels don't necessarily always fit. Do we need, generally speaking, a party that is more liberal and a party that is more conservative? Probably. Like we need an argument, right? I mean, party politics, it's about debate and compromise, not about directive. So you need the debate. You need options. You need people to be able to see different ways of doing things and vote for one and support one. So I would never ever say one party rule is good. I would never say ever that, oh, if only the Democrats had all the power. Not good. No party should have all the power. We need the debate and the compromise and options for people to be able to choose.
Yeah, Gloria's cheering you in the chat. I agree, Gloria. Okay, Troy's other part was, he said, it seems like marginalized people are gaining power to make America make good on its promises. He wonders if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's a lot of major change in American history has come about because marginalized people have said, hey, that document, those rights, that's essential part of being an American citizen that you're depriving us of, we demand it. That's a hard argument to fight against. And when you fight against it, you're often just racist. So, yes, our marginalized groups, can they use a moment, any moment? But right now, are they saying, you know what? There are a lot of us here, and we deserve to be a part of this process, and we are not going to be blotted out in the way that some on the right seem wanting to do? Yeah, like that's marginalized groups are powerful groups because they expose hypocrisy. They expose hypocrisy in a big way. And some people will see that message, and it's a hard message to fight. And if often you're tempted, if you're going to fight, oh, we're being hypocritic because we're favoring you and not favoring you, and you can't say it's wrong because it's right, then you just move on to force, right? And threats. Oh, well, in that case, we're just going to find a way to make you want to step back. American history is full of that. But yeah, I do think marginalized groups always have that kind of power. But in this moment, when really, honestly, I think Obama's presidency and a Black man becoming president set off a sort of rebound panic reaction among a certain kind of white man that felt that they should always have all the power. Yeah, it's going to be marginalized groups that are going to have particular power to step forward and say, you know what? Doesn't work. Really doesn't work. And we're here, and there are a lot of us, and we deserve the rights of citizens because we are. That's powerful.
All right. We've still got so many good questions. Okay, our good friend Miranda from Illinois says, can we look at history textbooks in Germany to see how they teach the 1930s as a blueprint to what our history books may or may not, I know I love Miranda so much, as a blueprint to what history books may or may not look like in the future, and use those as a deterrent in a sense that Christian groups look at the book of Revelation to adjust their behavior to avoid the possible future from happening? That's a deep question for a Friday.
Okay, so I'm gonna divide up that question. I don't think I would compare looking at the book of Revelations versus looking at German textbooks for the 1930s, right? So the book of Revelations in the Bible is a particular kind of a text. It's not a straight historical text. It's a complicated text. So if you're doing that, that's a very different thing than saying, how did Germans in the course of time write about this moment in their history that echoes, we're echoing that period. How did they do it? Now, you could do that, and you wouldn't be able to say immediately, and thus here's what we should do, because obviously, speaking as a historian, different country, different context, different culture, different lead up, different implications. But as far as the larger question of how, in the process of time, people in a country that very obviously had the rise, if you're talking about the rise of the Nazis as being a pretty strong indication of a particular kind of rise, and you want to see how that rise was talked about beforehand, that would be a really interesting, I'm going to sound so, I don't know. I was going to say an interesting data point, which is not how I see history, but that would be a really interesting kind of knowledge to have. It does not directly translate, but it would certainly have me asking interesting questions about how we talk about what we are seeing now and how we should report it. So that's a historian kind of thing to do, as long as you're aware that you can't translate it over immediately. It just becomes information that's going to help you sort through what's happening now. That's so much of what we do here on History Matters, is look at history to give context, not to tell us what to do. But if you know what's happened, and you know how it happened, and you know why it happened, and you know how it got us here, that certainly equips you better to think about what can happen going forward.
Yeah. All right. Frida's got a couple of questions in here I'm going to attempt to combine. Frida comes to us from Erie, Pennsylvania. She says, AIPAC and similar groups dumping obscene amounts of money into congressional races, using Israel as a focus, as a cover for a larger agenda. They supported election deniers. What can you say about this trend?
Wow. Well, that's a big question. Yeah. And I don't even know if I can answer all the parts of it. I would say, if you were financially supporting election deniers, that's a statement. That's an I don't believe in democracy statement. And if you are doing that, you should be held responsible for that and publicized as that. Because if you're doing it, obviously you believe in it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it. So, sometimes transparency and knowledge, often transparency and knowledge can be a very good thing. And, if we knew like these groups support election deniers and these corporations and PACs, this is where their funding comes from, that would be good to know, wouldn't it? The people who are like happily funding people who are denying a core component of democracy, because we know the election was challenged. I think it's 61 times it was challenged. There's no evidence of like major fraud. There's no evidence that anything was wrong. The victory was a victory. 61 times is a lot of times. So if you're denying the election, you're just lying at this point. And if people are supporting that, that's a statement.
Yeah, and Frida was saying that this was money into congressional races, not even presidential. And
right,
when you talk about the denials, the presidential one had 61 times, but we haven't been able to update a map we made years ago on congressional districts. We have not been able to update it since 2018. We couldn't put the 2020 data or the 2022 data in because there's still pending lawsuits. 4 years later, the people have already served almost their whole term, but we can't update the map because the elections are not certified. It's crazy.
Great example of exactly what we're talking about here.
Crazy.
I just saw Sean say something that's so on target, I'm going to read it. He says, I have my grandfather's copy of Mein Kampf. It was an American edition published in the 1940s with an editorial foreword explaining that this is horrific and disgusting, but we must know our enemy. That's really fascinating and smart.
Sean says a lot of really smart things in the chat. I learned from Sean.
A lot of you say a lot of smart things. This is because you're very best. Yeah.
Y'all should have Sean zoom in with your class, the teachers who are in the chat. Okay. The last part of Frida's question, I don't want to forget this part because it relates to something you spoke about earlier. She said, do you have suggestions on how we can push back on the press, print media, as well as TV and radio?
Well, I wanted O'Donnell to say that. Here's what I would recommend you do, because he would know, because he's in the press, right? I would certainly say speaking up, pointing it out, coming together in groups. Like, what if groups you belong to, actually, yesterday I saw, I think, a press release from the Harris campaign listing all of the lies in Trump's press conference, and essentially not necessarily calling out the press, but saying, so this is what actually happened, and it's what you should know. If on the one hand, first you're coming forward and speaking out and making it clear, and protesting against, as groups or in some other way, against the totally biased press. And I realize not buying their newspaper is one way of doing it, but you can't do that all by itself. That's certainly one way of doing things. But another way to do things is, and I think, that's effective, is to just come forward. And particularly if a nonpartisan, nonprofit group came forward and said, here are the facts that were stated, and here are the facts that, here's the truth, and here's where you can look this up a lot. I thought of this last night when I was listening to O'Donnell. I was like, wouldn't it be interesting if there was like a sort of, truth and lies show, and here we are in tonight's Truth and Lies show, where we're going to look at political statements that were made, and then we're going to look at what the actual answer is. Again, there are all kinds of reasons why that doesn't work, but
Yeah.
Oh, we're 4 minutes over. Okay.
Oh my gosh. We still have 7 questions. So I don't know if you want to have Claire email them to you, or
Yeah, Claire, email them. If there's one that seems like I can wrap it up, I'll do one more, but I'm going to ask Claire.
Okay, this is from someone that's calling themselves Mads Hatter, and I normally don't take questions unless people put a real name. So please don't be a troll who's going to like come on and do something crazy. But I like the question. It says, do you think Gen Z may have more power and influence in the election than other generations? After the pandemic and after everything we saw, is that undermined or valid?
Well, I would say I'll speak more broadly about that. I think in some ways we're seeing a generational shift. That's part of like my not unprecedented moment, but things that are defining this moment. I think we are watching a generational shift, and it started out as the press attacking one candidate for being old, but really we had 2 old candidates, and we've had a number of members of Congress also who are elderly, and um, people talking about, elderly judges should step down. That's been a focus. That's somewhat ageism. But I think also the question of, should there be younger people in politics? And now we're having that kind of moment. We have a younger candidate and we have younger people who are excited by that. That's some of what we're going to be seeing in coming months and coming years, is what happens when a younger generation is activated in this way, and how is that going to change our politics? Because it will. We just don't know how. So we're, in part, some of what we're looking at now is, I will say, is ageism, but some of what we're looking at now is truly a generational shift. And I don't know, we don't know how that will play out yet.
Yeah, I was just putting in the chat, and I think I misspelled the word activist. The young man, David Hogg, who was a victim of the Parkland High School shooting in Florida a few years ago, he has started they're doing really well, a PAC where they're only supporting candidates that are 35, around 35 and under. And he was pushing very hard for Governor Walz. And so I don't know if that had any influence on Harris's decision to pick him, but he was campaigning very hard. And Walz is not under the age of 35, but I think he saw that he was aligned with the ideals that the younger voters are concerned about: climate change, the environment, gun
Which
control.
I think is good.
Yeah, I mean, I've been impressed by that kid so much. I've been following him very carefully, and the work they're doing. I like the idea that these kids that have been victimized by these policies aren't going to have it anymore.
And I'm going to say one last thing, and then we can go to the after party. But I want to reiterate what I did say. Gloria says ageism is a prejudice. It is. So, and I just want to say, and I said several times that some of what's happening here is ageism, and that is bad. So I don't mean to be saying, certainly someone who's on the upper end of the spectrum would not say that age in some way disempowers you or makes you incompetent or anything like that. And I think some of what we're seeing now is ageism. But I also think there is a generational shift happening right now, and that matters. Okay. Okay.
Claire's already emailed us the question. She's that.
Oh, Claire, you're so quick. Okay. Oh, Mad said not in an ageist way, but that younger people have seen. Yeah, well, younger people are going to have a different perspective. Yeah, for sure. And a different outlook on their future, and going to have different political understandings and goals than anyone else, and that will matter. And they're entitled to that. Yay, democracy. Okay. Let me explain what's going to happen next. So we do go to the after party. And what that means is we will no longer be recording. So that we can be even freer and easier than we normally are to talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, then stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us from Facebook, you need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. I will also say now that I have a YouTube channel, I'm very proud of myself for doing that. Dr. Joanne B. Freeman, I'm not going to be able to tell you how to find it because I'm not that good technologically, but and NCHE has a YouTube channel as well. So I did that just so it would be easier to find stuff in another way, but either through me or through NCHE, stuff's going to be appearing there too. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna Oh, no, I'm not done. What can I heaven forbid I don't say thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy, which I say every week. Heaven forbid.
Yes.
Honestly, though, you know, I don't know about you, but certainly for me, as I'm watching things unfold in the O'Donnell conversation yesterday, I'm watching that, and part of me is thinking, oh, we need to talk about this tomorrow. Like, there are things to talk about. And the talking about part of it is the crucial part of it, right? We can think what we want, we can do what we want, we can vote as we want. But when we come together to process things and think about things and act together, and do so by choice, it's democracy, right? Coming together and working towards a goal that you believe in a democratic system with free and fair elections, assuming that the people you give power to are accountable for how they use that power, rule of law, right? All of that. That's democracy. And us having these conversations here and agreeing or disagreeing with each other week after week for now 228 weeks, this is democracy speaking. So thank you all for being here as ever. Thank you to Annie and Claire and NCHE and John for being here to support this. And I will see you all next week. And who the heck knows what's going to happen by then? We're sort of on a minute by minute, like, ooh, it's been 2 minutes. Has there been a major news story yet?
Right.
But everybody have a really wonderful good week, and I will see you next week.